설치할 땐 뭐를 잠가야지?
깡통은 자 여기다 따로 모아놓자.
음식은 먹을 만큼만 하거라.
종이컵 대신 머그잔이 어때?
신문지는 따로 모으세요.
안 쓰는 전기 코드는 빼놔야죠.
지구를 가장 빛나는 별로 만들어주세요. 한일 공동 캠페인.
Herod the Great ruled the Holy Land in the years leading up to the birth of Jesus. History and scripture paint him as a homicidal dictator, the man who attempted the murder of the infant Christ and even ordered the deaths of many of his own family. But Herod's reputation for brutality has overshadowed his life as a visionary builder. He was the architect of the most ambitious construction projects ever undertaken in the Holy Land. He left a legacy in stone which still survives today, and now our investigators are searching for it. From Masada, where his fortress defies gravity, hanging from sheer cliffs, to Caesarea, where he built the world's first man-made harbor. At Herodium, Herod built a mountain to conceal a fortified palace. And in Jerusalem, he built the Temple Mount, in its time, the largest structure on earth. Our investigators will explore how these revolutionary buildings were created.
How the hell did he get everything up there?
And they'll come to understand the scale, the daring, and the innovation that produced these extraordinary feats of engineering. This is the lost world of Herod the Great. This desert is the most desolate place in Israel, dry and blasted by the sun. 2,000 years ago in 37 BC, when this land was called Judea, the newly crowned King Herod came here. By the shores of the Dead Sea, at a place called Masada, he had decided to build a cliff-top fortress. The walls of this fortress still stand, and our investigators have come to explore them. Ori Soltis is an archaeologist from Georgetown University in Washington. He's an expert in the history of the Holy Land. Ori intends to build a picture of the world of King Herod from the evidence that remains on this rock.
So now we're going through this little passageway.
Right.
Ah, yes, into the Colodarium, because we can see, well, what do we see here beneath the floor level?
Mark Telesnik is a geotechnical engineer from Haifa University in northern Israel. He wants to find out how the builders of Herod's fortress were able to work on a site which would be challenging even with the aid of today's technology. It stands on a plateau 1,500 feet above the plain that surrounds it. And Mark immediately sees that Herod's engineers must have lived with the risk of a catastrophic rockfall.
All the rock is severely cracked. Everywhere we can look, the rock is very severely cracked. Nobody took any chances here. If we look at these 4 huge bolts, they go in about 15, 20 meters into the mountainside. It'd be interesting to know if the engineers in Herod's time actually thought of this.
Herod had little concern for the safety of his workers. His only interest was in the transformation of this site. It would become not only a palace, but a place of refuge. He needed it because his position was far from secure. He hadn't inherited the crown. He was not of the Jewish royal family. Instead, he had clawed his way up through a combination of ruthlessness and political cunning. He ruled because he had the backing of the ancient world superpower, Rome. But he would always be resented by the Jewish elite and by his subjects. He was a king imposed on them by a foreign power, and he could never be sure of their loyalty. So Masada was vital to him, a place where he could retreat in the event of unrest or an attempted coup. Masada is a place without water, shade, food, or fuel. But guided by historian Albert Baumgarten, Mark Telesnik realizes that for a builder like King Herod, Masada had one vital resource: stone.
This is the quarry. Oh, wow, that's great.
Herod's engineers used this rough stone to surround the whole plateau with a wall nearly a mile long. Called a casemate, this wall was special. With a cavity in the middle, it had two functions. Albert Baumgarten shows Ori Soltis the inside of it.
So we've actually come inside the casemate wall here, right? So we've got the outer and the inner wall.
That's right. They could be rooms that you would use for living. They would be rooms that you could use for storage. Or they could also be rooms that you would pack with rubble to make the wall stronger at different points.
Got it.
The casemate walls were large enough to house the troops that Herod had stationed here. Mark can see that the people who built them must have put their lives at risk.
Just by looking, I can't see obviously below the ground surface, but it doesn't look like they've hardly got any foundation. But it's amazing how close to the edge the buildings sit.
Small chippings helped to hold the large stones in place.
They were using what they had.
That's right.
They were using what they had, and that's the reason why we're going to follow all these small pieces of stone that actually make the wall stable, because the moment you take little pieces like this out, the larger stones don't fit together so well. If you had to place those stones when they...
Oh, if I had to place those stones?
Yeah.
I'd have to be either paid very well or very scared of Herod.
Herod instilled fear in everyone around him. He took pleasure from displaying his mastery of nature. If it was hot, he demanded cool. And here, in the middle of the desert, at the northern tip of the rock, he ordered the construction of a lavish bath complex.
So this is where we would leave our clothes.
That's right.
And then we enter into, this room is
This is the room where, the warm room.
the tepidarium.
The tepidarium. We would actually start in this room and begin here in the cold room.
Bathhouses would become a feature of all of Herod's palaces, demonstrating his status and wealth.
Along the walls you can see examples of the wall painting.
So now we're going through this little passageway.
Right.
Ah, yes, into the colidarium, because we can see, well, what do we see here beneath the floor level?
Okay,
What's
what we
going
see
on?
here is the heating system of the hottest part of the bath.
A furnace heats air which is piped along under the floor and across the walls. The system creates a room whose temperature is perfectly controllable.
So we have, I mean, it's brilliant. We have the stones, then we have the material that holds the tiles, then we've got the tiles, then we've got more plaster, then we've got painting.
That's right.
So we've got this whole series of layers.
Well, this is a very carefully and very well constructed building that's been thought out.
So that, of course, brings up a question.
Yes.
There's heat coming from hot water, coming from fire,
Right.
coming from where are they getting the material to create the fire, the wood.
They're bringing the wood in from wherever they need to bring it in order to be able to have a bath and the fire.
So again, money is no object.
Money is no
Herod
object.
brings in the wood from wherever he needs
Okay.
to.
Slave labor would solve another problem: water. Channels were dug to collect rain.
The channels are deliberate attempts to direct the water in a particular way
So
and to
Herod-
make sure, yes.
Herod dug these channels.
That's right.
And you can still see the greenery in these channels.
That's right.
Suggests that there's still moisture down there.
There still is some moisture there.
In the winter months, rainwater from two pools west of Masada was diverted to underground storage cisterns. They had a capacity of 40,000 cubic meters. Slaves would then carry this water by hand to the top of the mountain.
When we were here,
The most daring piece of engineering was the construction of Herod's hanging palace. It sat 1,000 feet above the plain. These lower levels of Herod's palace were built on terraces cut into the northern cliff face. Because the rock forms distinctive hard and soft bands, it was easy for Herod's engineers to cut down and find the next course of good stone to build on.
Okay? And the beauty of these planes is it's very easy to bring them apart. Once you break these things into layers, it's very easy to build this step function.
Herod would have accessed these levels by coming down from the summit.
This is a stairway. Comes all the way out here, and they walk out onto a deck, and you can see.
This is the deck.
No, but look at look at this. It's screaming out, "Put something on top of me."
It is?
Yes.
Okay.
If the engineering was daring, the decoration was lavish.
What we have to imagine here is a series of columns and then a roof going over the whole thing, creating a covered portico where you're protected from the sun at its worst, and you also have the advantage of being open to breezes and to enjoy the view.
It's great.
Yes. Well, when you're the richest man in the East, you can do things.
You sure can.
Masada, King Herod's mountaintop stronghold, was an engineering landmark. He had turned a seemingly uninhabitable rock into an oasis. In addition to a magnificent hanging palace, Herod had a selection of bathhouses as sophisticated as any in Rome. And he had achieved all this in the middle of a desert. His desire to pair luxury with security would become a hallmark of all of his buildings. Masada was just the beginning. Herod the Great was about to embark on the most ambitious construction project his kingdom had ever seen. Herod the Great ruled the Holy Land as a dictator. He ruled through fear, and he lived in fear of assassination, treachery, and attack. Herod trusted no one, preferring instead to put his faith in bricks and mortar. Our investigators have already seen the scale of the defensive fortress he built on the cliff top of Masada, and this was something that would be repeated throughout the kingdom. He built himself no fewer than 11 fortresses. Now we've come to the most magnificent of them all, the place he named after himself, the Herodium. Herod began building here early in his reign, and work would continue for 3 decades. At first glance, the site appears to be the cone of a volcano. But appearances are deceptive. Ori Soltis is going to explore the extraordinary secrets of the hill. He is guided by local expert Marty Freelander. As they climb, there is no sign of any man-made fortification. Then, as they reach the summit, 2,460 feet above sea level, they see that the hill held a vast palace.
Wow, this is really something, isn't it?
Stupendous.
The Herodium is 650 feet in diameter.
We've got this enormous circular construction. Did he just build it on top of the hill? Or, I mean, what happened?
He takes an innocent little hill on the edge of a desert, and he creates his own mountain here.
Wow.
Engineer Mark Telesnik specializes in large, earth-moving projects. He wants to understand exactly what Herod did here.
I'm here to figure out how this thing was built.
The first question is just how much of this is natural and how much is man-made.
What I'd really like to see is if we can scamper up here, try to look at the contact between the bedrock and the artificial cone. It looks to me that it's right about here, at this terrace right here, and this is where the engineers started with the mountain. They started a hill here and built that. Okay, here we go.
But how was it done?
How does he take this mountain out of a hill? One thing is he takes the nearby hill over there and he shaves it off. Look at that nice flat top. That had probably been relatively the same size as the hill over here. He takes earth, rocks from over there, and he spills them up at the top of this mountain.
The driving force behind this project was Herod's ego. He wanted his palace to be the tallest, most imposing thing in the desert.
Let's see if we can scramble up here, get up to the top.
The steep slopes had a practical defensive purpose. It would be impossible to get a siege engine up here.
Whew, it's getting steeper and steeper.
We've moved up about 20 meters. Let's see if we can't take a reading here. Okay, Bubble, come here. Gotcha. Okay, that's about 45 degrees, so it makes it even more difficult also for us to climb and for anyone else here who was trying to do this in the past.
Standing at the top, 400 feet higher than any of the neighboring hills, Herod had a clear view of Jerusalem 15 miles away. And Jerusalem would have been able to see him. The volcano-like shape was produced by banking earth up against the outer walls, which gained strength from their circular design. A second wall rings the first.
So this is where the guards would have patrolled as they're marching around.
So you're
right?
walking between the two walls?
4 towers marked the points of the compass. The eastern one was the largest by 3 stories. It held Herod's private quarters.
This is really the centerpiece. It fills several functions. Not only can you observe from outside, it's also very cool up there. And so if Herod wanted any refuge from the heat, and there he's got the room with the view, and it's the coolest room with the view.
You'll get the breeze, the only place with breeze.
Yeah.
Ori makes his way through an opening, which was Herod's personal entrance to the palace. It once led straight into a courtyard garden.
Well, forget about the rubble here. This is at the top of his flight of 200 steps.
Wow.
Here you'd walk in here, and then, magnificent, he's arrived. Here, everything is different. It's green, it's plaster, there's stucco, and there's fresco. Beautiful gardens. You've got his entire apartments are here.
Across 2 floors, every luxury was installed. There was the elaborate bath complex that would be built in every one of his residences. There was a cold room, a warm room, a sauna, a Turkish bath, a plunge pool. The design of this room in particular is remarkable.
We're now in the tepid room, the tepidarium. But what's really fascinating and momentous is up on the top. You're looking at the first domed ceiling known to the Western world, built by Herod here.
So this is another instance of Herod being a visionary. He's the first one who really thinks of doing this, of giving us a kind of miniature heaven.
He makes this synthesis that no one's thought of before. Herod, right here.
And the top would have been open. It's an oculus, right?
Right,
I mean, it's
right.
covered over now, but it would have been open. The light would have come in.
Right.
Very nice. And the whole thing probably would have been covered with frescoed plaster throughout.
Frescoes, geisha girls, it's
whole
a big
9 yards.
pleasure dome.
This may be the first domed room ever constructed. It is a sign of the ambition and innovation that Herod demanded from his builders. Mark Telesnik studies the stone to understand how they achieved what was a massive engineering breakthrough.
Okay, very neat. The shape of the stones running through the top of the oculus here are quite interesting because they have to pick the compression loads up in 2 directions.
All stone structures are held together by compression, the force of one block pressing upon another. In an arch, they spread in just 2 dimensions. In a dome, all the stones share the forces in every direction.
It'd be interesting how they actually did the building itself. Romans used formwork to make arches. I wonder if they used formwork to make a dome. But they also could have used sand, and by making a pile of sand in the right shape, and then build the brickwork above the sand, and then remove the sand. Interesting. This is great.
To provide a constant supply of water, Herod ordered the digging of vast cisterns.
Where are we coming to now?
This was a cistern we're walking into. A couple of times a year there's a good rainfall. It would be held in the cistern that we're about to enter.
And I guess some of the guard room is down here? No sunlight for the guards.
Right. Sorry, guys, but the Roman soldiers don't know what hit them. Now you're getting the idea of an engineering genius. Now, if you look sharp, you can see that there's a water line showing how far up Herod's cistern was full.
The Herodium was intended to show Herod's mastery of the desert. At its base, 38 acres of barren land were turned into a separate pleasure palace with sumptuous gardens. A colossal pool filled by its own aqueduct formed the centerpiece.
Now, the whole place would have been surrounded by gardens, very sumptuous, very, of course, impressive. Remember, you're in the middle of a desert, and he has created a temperate climate in the middle of the tropics here.
Larger than 2 Olympic swimming pools, small boats are said to have sailed on it. This construction in the desert, part oasis, part fortress, demonstrates clearly how Herod saw the world. He was a visionary. He had wealth and power, almost beyond imagining, and he needed more than anything else to demonstrate that power. He would overcome nature and the desert, and he would dominate his kingdom. But his ambition would not stop there. He wanted to compete on the world stage, to show that he was worthy of the favor shown him by his Roman masters. He would build a new city whose magnificence would rival Rome itself.
당신의 얼굴은 잠깐 찡그려지지만 누군가의 얼굴은 평생 활짝 피어납니다. 헌혈을 위한 1초의 찡그림, 세상에서 가장 아름다운 표정입니다. 공익광고협의회.
제2차 세계대전. 그 누구도 보지 못했던 2차 세계대전의 이공계 컬러 영상.
All of Herod the Great's achievements have been overshadowed by his reputation as a ruthless dictator. And yet, Herod was obsessed by building. Our investigators have seen how a combination of ambition, ego, and paranoia drove him to create a series of formidable fortresses. But in 28 BC, he began a new project that would eclipse all the others. It was the construction of an entire new city on Judea's Mediterranean coast. It would include the world's first man-made harbor. It was called Caesarea. Engineer Mark Telesnik wants to find out where Herod's harbor stood. He is guided by archaeologist Josef Porath, who has excavated here for over 20 years.
the original breakwater was about?
The original breakwater, it continues over there. It was a huge harbor. 450 meters was the length.
To understand just how far the harbor reached, you have to go right out into the sea.
We are now above the opening in the breakwater of the harbor.
That is amazing. And so we had the two breakwaters that would meet here, and with an opening of about 35 meters in between them, and the ships would enter the harbor there.
There were two high towers that ships can see it from a distance.
Would there be lighthouses up there?
Yes, yes.
The Romans, in the Bay of Naples, were the first to notice that volcanic ash would harden underwater. Known as pozzolana, it would become the first underwater cement. It enabled Herod to realize his vision for Caesarea. Archaeologists have discovered the remains of wooden frames, which were built up beneath the water and then filled with stones and this cement.
So what you're saying is they actually built it out as a caisson.
Yeah.
Out at sea.
Yeah.
So they would have these wooden bins that they would float out.
Yes.
Fill them partially.
Yeah.
With the rock and concrete.
Yes.
Sink it down in place.
Yeah.
Go back and get another one.
Yes.
This was a groundbreaking piece of engineering. The first completely artificial deep water harbor. What no one predicted was the action of the sea against the wall. Within only a few years, sand had piled up against the breakwater and a new stretch of land had formed. Herod's architects found a use for it. They built a full-size hippodrome for chariot racing.
Here is the starting gates where the chariots were hauled, and then the gates were opened simultaneously.
So is this rock with the groove in it actually the idea that it's a fence opening up?
It's possibly a gate, yeah.
From the gate, each chariot covered the same distance to a central barrier. From there on, the race was a free-for-all around several circuits of the track. The tiered seating all around could hold 8,000 spectators. As Caesarea grew, the capacity was doubled.
Okay, here you can see the nice segment of well-preserved tiers. So what is important for us is to observe the turn. There were all the accidents.
So when people came to sit, would they actually sit there just to see the crashes?
Yeah, they enjoyed it.
They enjoyed the
Yeah,
crashes?
sure.
And would they have run on the sand?
Yes. Arena is sand in Latin.
Ah, I did not know that.
Herod succeeded in building the most modern city in the Roman world.
Herod brought to Judea Roman architects, and his theater, as well as the circus that we visited before, they both were designed according to Roman aspects.
And Roman-style theaters were always of a semicircular shape. This was the very first theater in Judea. Its clever design was based upon an understanding of acoustics, which ensured that the slightest sound was clearly audible from the upper seats.
What was special about the acoustics in the theater?
As the back of the stage was a high constructed wall, all the sound was pushed from the stage to the audience. All the voices were heard all over. What a
nice view, eh?
Nice view.
Best seats in the house.
Nice performance soon to the sunset.
Herod called his city Caesarea to honor his patron, the Roman Empire. The entire project was intended as a piece of flattery. And it worked. By building a Roman city in a Jewish country, Herod ran the risk of angering his subjects. To keep their loyalty, he had to keep them happy. And again, he chose to do it by building. He would rebuild the city of Jerusalem. The result would be one of the greatest engineering feats in history. the city of Jerusalem, the capital of the Holy Land. Our investigators' quest to find the lost world of King Herod the Great brings them to the place where he would make his greatest impact. Herod was violent and ruthless, but he was also smart. He knew that if he kept his subjects happy, then they would be easier to govern. He gave them food, entertainment, and most importantly, water. The Judeans were among the earliest peoples to value cleanliness and hygiene in their religious observance as well as everyday life. So Herod gave them the gift of rebuilding and expanding Jerusalem's largest public bath. It was known as the Pool of Siloam. Helped by Io Marin, Mark Telesnik heads to the part of Jerusalem known as the City of David. He wants to discover what the pool looked like in Herod's time. Although it is well known from the Bible, it has only recently been discovered.
Can you tell me what the pool is used for?
Well, basically, the first need, of course, is for drinking, so drinking water, and another major purpose was for ritual bathing.
Each year, over 150,000 pilgrims would come here to visit the temple on the mount above. Every one of them needed to perform a cleansing ritual in the water.
Just to give you the impression how big it was, you can see down below one corner of the pool, and the opposite corner is over there, just where the people are gathering. This is one side of the pool, which is about 50 meters long, and then you have the other side, presumably another 100 meters to that direction, creating a pool with a space of approximately 4,000 square meters.
That's huge.
It is indeed huge, yes.
Larger than 2 football fields.
It is, yes.
The water to fill it came from the Gihon Spring just 1,400 feet away. Mark Telesnik discovers that Herod's engineers were able to direct and control the flow.
Oh, that's amazing. Very cool. We're sitting at a fault, a fracture in the rock. The fault runs all the way up to the ground surface, and the engineers, whoever they were, utilized the fault in order to create a spillway. In this way, they could control where water was going in the different areas and control the height of or depth of water in the pool simply by closing a valve and having the water siphon off in one direction or the other.
This is how the Siloam pool would have looked in Herod's time. It was the site of one of the Gospel's most famous stories, the healing of the blind man.
Even though Jesus lived a few years after the time of King Herod, this was the pool that he knew. This was the pool in which the actual story of the cure, the healing of the blind man.
That's a great story.
When Herod came to power, much of Jerusalem's water flowed along ancient tunnels cut through the rock. They pass in a network through the hills around the city. Io Marin takes engineer Mark Telesnik on an underground tour to see exactly what the tunnel builders were up against. If the path of an aqueduct was blocked by a hill, it was sometimes easier to cut through it than go all the way around. But that didn't mean that tunneling was ever an easy option.
I see that we're entering a section of the tunnel where the roof is much lower, and I'm just looking at the rock that makes up the roof here, and it's all made of flint or chert, which is a very, very hard rock.
Does it have any significance?
Well, it's much, much harder than the rock that's around, all the limestone. And I imagine they just got tired of battling through this stuff, and they came down below, and even today, contractors would have difficulty working with this stuff.
Herod set about upgrading Jerusalem's water supply. His engineers built a new aqueduct to carry fresh water from the pools of Solomon near Bethlehem. This was known as the Upper Aqueduct. Today, most of it is lost. But Mark Telesnik and Io Marin tried to find one of the few sections that survive.
You know, this is one segment of the Upper Aqueduct which was kept almost intact for 2,000 years. So it's really impressive.
What's the aqueduct lined with?
Well, basically, this is plaster, which is an hydraulic plaster, preventing leakage water throughout the system. The greyish color here is a hint to the fact that it was made in the time of Herod, because they used to combine ashes within the mortar, within the plaster, which gave it its distinctive color.
I always wanted to be a municipal worker. Let's find out.
The gradient of a Roman aqueduct could be tiny. This section looks totally flat, and Mark wants to find out if it slopes at all.
Let's try to get some more in here to see if we can't find an overall direction. And we just don't have enough water.
Well, no, it does. Look.
Oh, okay, there is a very gentle flow in this direction. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Lovely.
So good for Herod's engineers.
Incredibly, Herod's upper aqueduct dropped just 54 feet over its 9-mile length.
As long as the water is high enough within the pipe, the flow will always go in the direction downstream, from high to low. That's the way physics works.
Absolutely.
The very best preserved aqueduct in Israel was built to supply Herod's city of Caesarea. Archaeologist Yosef Porth takes Mark Telesnik to the water source, the springs at Mount Carmel, some 5 miles away.
What elevation will this be at? We are at about 50 meters above sea level? Yeah. The source is over there. Here you can see the water running.
From here, the water was directed along covered channels.
See the original part. As you climb up, you can see the gabled roof to protect the water from contamination, because this drinking water. Okay.
The water filled this storage pool before being channeled down into the valley towards Caesarea. For the last 5 miles, a raised aqueduct carried the water along the coast to the city. It was the finest waterway ever constructed in this country. And yet, Herod's most ambitious architectural project was yet to come. It would be construction on a scale never before seen, and it would dominate Jerusalem from that time to this. Our investigators are uncovering the legacy of King Herod the Great. A series of monumental structures built across Judea in his 33-year reign. During that time, Herod worked hard to please his masters, the great men of Rome who had given him his crown. At the same time, his subjects resented him. He was a king who had been imposed by a foreign power. So Herod sought to prove himself to his people. He did it by giving them the greatest gift imaginable. He would rebuild the temple, the place held by Jews to be the holiest on earth. Ori Soltis and historian Ken Spiro have come to the site where Herod's temple stood. It is long since gone, but much of the huge wall that surrounded it survives. This section is known as the Western Wall.
A retaining wall that Herod built, and yet it has become this wall to the Jewish people over the centuries as if it were a piece of the temple itself, right?
The irony of ironies, Herod, whose relationship with the people he was king of was so ambivalent at best and often incredibly hostile, that what he built should be considered the holiest spot in the world for the Jews is very interesting, to say the least.
What can be seen here is only a fragment of what Herod built. To get an idea of the true scale of the Temple Mount, Mark Telesnik crosses the valley to the Mount of Olives. Only from this distance is it possible to take in the enormity of what was attempted here.
Okay, nice view.
Today, a gold-domed mosque marks the site where Herod's temple stood.
So we've gotten to a beautiful overlook here.
Herod's big challenge, engineering-wise, was how to build a huge platform on the top of what is a mountain. So what he decides to do, and he does it in a way that's unprecedented in the ancient world, is he builds a very large wall around the entire upper part of the hill over here, which enables him to lay this surface down.
You have dimensions on that?
Yeah, about a little less than 500 meters by about 300 meters. And again, keep in mind, when Herod finished this is the largest man-made platform on the planet Earth. You can stick approximately 24 football fields up there.
Herod had to reshape and extend the Temple Mount platform, and to hold the colossal mass of earth in place, he enclosed the entire area with a vast wall. Mark Telesnik makes his way down to the southeastern corner to see exactly how this wall was built.
Here we see the entire height of this wall. A 100-foot high wall, about a 10-story building. The stones are 3 thick. You have this zipper effect of header and springer stones, it's called. Massive stones converging on a corner, making a zipper. So you have the long stone, the short stone, long stone, short stone, long stone, short stone, going all the way up to the top.
The wall is only part of the structure. To make up the level of the sloping hillside, Herod's engineers built a network of huge arched vaults. Mark Telesnik and Ken Spiro follow a tunnel beneath the western wall. Here, hidden far below present-day ground level, lie the finest examples of Herod's stonework. They are the key to the Temple Mount's construction.
If you look at the stones here, they're very, very pristine. You can see it's perfect, almost no wear. They look pretty much just like the day they were put in. You can even see the mason marks, the chisel marks done 2,000 years ago by Herod's stonemasons. And you can see beautifully here, no erosion. The beautiful seam, you notice there's nothing, you can't even fit a credit card through the stones here. Perfectly cut and perfectly placed. And look at this stone, it's just magnificent. It looks like it was put in yesterday.
Some of the stones used to build Herod's retaining wall are of an unbelievable size.
There we go. We got 44 feet, 4 inches. That's a long stone. Let's just get the height of this block. We're here at 11 feet, 3 inches. I happen to know that this stone is about 16.5 feet thick. This way. Let's crunch some numbers. Density of limestone, say 2.4 tons per meter cubed. So we got a rock that is about 550 tons of stone. That's a big stone. One big rock.
As well as constructing the Temple Mount, Herod set about expanding the city. He added a second wall and built himself a palace far away from the Jewish quarter. He effectively segregated Jerusalem.
His own palace is actually well outside, well west of the Temple Mount area.
Herod is, when he builds, he's such a contrasting personality. On one hand, he's got his Jewish site, the Temple Mount,
right,
and then he's got his
Roman
palace, his palace site.
His fortifications still remain.
We're looking at is the courtyard of what's called the Citadel, meaning a lot of what you see in the inside here actually dates back to Herod's time.
Herod made sure it was heavily defended.
This is the moat. So it's absolutely the way Herod would have built it. This is a dry moat. Here, they just make a ditch to make added fortifications.
Right here. And these are Herodian stones, the large ones.
100%.
Despite his great wealth and power, Herod's paranoia followed him everywhere. It is reflected in the design of the towers around this citadel.
The towers you can see, which really you have one tower over there, 2 and 3, and it's interesting, you notice that the 2 biggest towers are actually facing the inside of the city. It's ironic, you'd think they'd be on the outside, which, okay, people like to say about Herod, he was far more worried about his Jewish subjects than he was about the Romans, which is probably correct. He certainly was always much more afraid of Jews.
The intention was that no one coming into the temple complex could doubt Herod's power or his piety. The Judeans entered by the southern steps. As Mark finds out, even these were specially designed.
Herod and his engineers and architects, they thought of everything. If you look at the stairs, you'll notice they're different lengths.
Yep.
Look, you have a distance of here about a yard, and here a foot. A yard and a foot. It was designed so that you have to think consciously as you're walking up the steps and preparing yourself before you actually enter the Temple Mount.
King Solomon had built the first temple, and Herod set out with the deliberate intention of outshining him. His temple, not a stone of which is still in place, stood 174 feet tall.
That's a way of immortalizing himself and also impressing the Jewish people. He wanted people to look at this building and say, now that's a building. And he, ironically, it's interesting, although he wasn't a very nice person, he's one of the only people who has the title the Great.
Herod's Temple Mount complex was the most important building in the Holy Land. It represented the peak of Herod's achievement, glorifying the Jewish nation. It was the culmination of all his building projects. As our investigators have found, it benefited from the knowledge acquired at Masada, how to reinforce dangerous slopes, how to sculpt great slabs of rock. From the Herodium, the temple builders learned scale and how to build on different levels. The construction of an entire city at Caesarea appeared to suggest nothing was beyond Herod's reach. And the Temple Mount was the final proof. King Herod will always be remembered as a villain, ruthless, single-minded, and driven by ego. And yet, it is this man, these very characteristics, which produced some of history's most extraordinary engineering feats. In the spring of 2007, archaeologists digging at the site of Herodium discovered a highly decorated tomb. Though there is no inscription naming the person for whom this grave was made, its richness and its location lead the archaeologists to believe that this is the final resting place of Herod the Great. Research continues, but if they're right, they have found the tomb of the ancient world's greatest builder.
History Channel.